Welcome, everyone, to this online plenary where we're going to be discussing how we fight and win a world against racism and fascism. I hope everyone's enjoyed the workshops that have started off this conference. But just to introduce myself, my name is Nadia Sayed, and I'm going to be chairing this plenary this evening. And I think it's important to say that, we're now at a crucial moment in the struggle against racism. We've got an increasingly racist government introducing ever more vicious legislation against refugees and migrants, denying the existence of institutional racism and cracking down on protests. But despite this, things like public support for opposition to racism, footballers taking the knee, and the solidarity we've seen with Afghan refugees, all of these things are things that have grown massively. And so with that, I want to hand over to my co-chair, who's going to introduce the rest of the session.
Thank you very much, Nadia. And yeah, I just want to add to what Nadia has said. And really, the global racist tide will only be driven back by anti-racists standing up and confronting it. From Germany to Greece to the United States, people who want a society free from racism are saying no more. People are taking to the streets and online in large numbers to oppose racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and to say that migrants and refugees are welcome. So we have a fantastic lineup to bring all of that home. And with that, I would like to welcome you all to the International Plenary of the Stand Up to Racism International Conference, World Against Racism and Fascism. Nadia?
Thank you, Barbara. So to introduce our first speaker, who's going to kick off what is a fantastic lineup for this plenary, is Mohammed Asif, who is the director of Afghan Human Rights Foundation. Mohammed fled Afghanistan in 2000 and came to seek safe sanctuary in Glasgow, Scotland. He's now the director of Afghan Human Rights Foundation, which is an independent, non-governmental, non-partisan and non-profit organization working to promote human rights and democracy. So a very warm welcome to Mohammed.
Good evening. Thank you, everyone. And it's a great pleasure to be here and among those who sacrifice their own timing. I think it's Saturday today, and, it's a great tribute to you all, to be here and fighting our corners, the corners of refugees and Muslims and migrants, gays and lesbian and others in our society. This shows that, how great individuals still exist in this country on the top of this racist Tory government. I came here as you say 20 years ago, 21 years ago, nearly 22 this April, maybe. And it was just like yesterday, when we arrived at 3 o'clock in the morning in Britain, it was the Labour government during that time. When I arrived, the very next day, I saw racism on the streets of Glasgow and other parts of Britain. I was quite shocked when we were told by this, UK BBC propaganda machine that Britain is an equal society. And when I saw things, I was really, really shocked. The first thing I was really shocked was that we were not allowed to work. We were not allowed even to receive guests, to have friends to come and visit us, the accommodation where we were given. In Scotland, there were so many things that our rights were taken away. We were not even given that, £36 a week. We were given vouchers, and that reminded me of the Nazi Germany. Although, I don't compare this country to a Nazi Germany, but, where the Jews were asked to wear the yellow stars, asylum seekers were given that sort of vouchers. 21 years ago, nearly 22 years ago. And I was really, really shocked, that in this country, a civilized country, a democratic regime, that asylum seekers and refugees were so degraded, insulted by the system here. It doesn't matter which party is in power, the rights of asylum seekers and refugees and migrants are being taken away by the state or by the government here in this country. But we started our campaign. A lot of my colleagues are still here in Scotland and Britain, along with many prominent politicians, including Jeremy Corbyn and our First Minister here in Scotland and the Deputy First Minister and many other Labour activists here in Scotland. And we started to raise, that racism against asylum seekers and refugees in 21st century. And 20 years later or 21 years later, it's very sad that we're still in the same position, that racism has increased, it rather than decrease against asylum seekers or refugees. There is racism, obviously, there are people who don't want refugees or migrants or Muslim or LGBT or any other groups in this country. But there is a state racism, institutional racism, driven by the government or currently by the Tory government. And of course, the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, or the awful Patel, as I call her, because, there's openly racism against asylum seekers, again, Muslim, every failure in this country, if the economy fail, it's blame on asylum seekers or refugees or migrants. It says that asylum seekers takes away your job, they take away your resources. The people were told that we are given £300 a week, luxury houses, accommodation. We were given preferential treatment by the British government. All these were, lies created by the British right-wing media and the right-wing politicians, including the mainstream politicians as well, that we were given every facilities. If I tell you, probably many of you know in this country and this group as well, that 21 years ago, we were given, asylum seekers were given £36 a week. And 21 years later, asylum seekers are given £37 a week. So, the Home Office is so generous, they have increased £1 within 21 years. They have increased, the amount of the allowances of asylum seekers by £1 and a few penny. And so that's the sort of, resources asylum seekers receive. If there is any failure by the state, the Muslims are blamed, asylum seekers are blamed. We have a prime minister who call my sisters, my brothers, my mothers, my daughters, litter boxes and bank robbers, who call African migrants, with low or African origin people with lower IQ compared to the white people. We have this Home Secretary, who is openly promoting racism and fascism in our societies here. But the good thing is that we have great activists, great humanitarian. There is a lot of people in this country like yourself and others who are present in this room fighting the racist policies of the Tories and Priti Patel and fighting the corners of asylum seekers and refugees. If I talk about my own country, my own country is destroyed. Basically, when we were asking for a political solution 20 years ago, I took part in every protest and I spoke on major issues along with Jeremy Corbyn and Tony Benn and others, in the movement. And we said that Afghanistan needed a political solution. Now the White House and others are saying that no one is winning the war in Afghanistan and we have to have some sort of solution. So rather than killing so many thousands, hundreds of thousands of Afghans are killed, millions were migrated or forced to migrate from Afghanistan. Millions become homeless, the same in Iraq, in Libya, and Syria, and Yemen, and Somalia, and Sudan, in Eritrea, and so many other countries, with the support of British and America and NATO for the illegal wars around the world. Then when we come here, we are told you're not wanted here. Asylum seekers are blamed for bringing diseases, for bringing, so many problems into this country. I'm an asylum seeker. When I arrived in this country, I was not allowed to work for 6 months. I applied to the Home Office that I'm able, I'm healthy, I want to work. And I was told, no, you're not allowed to work. Since I'm allowed 21 years ago in this country, I have worked every single day. I have contributed to the society. I have contributed to the politics. Whether you agree or you don't agree, but I have done my bits in this society. But we have the racist movement now basically driven by the state, and the state is the Tories, the Home Secretary, that, criminalizing a section of the society, the very victims of British and American bombs. I always repeat myself wherever I give my speech. As if you look around the world, look at the countries at the Home Office list where asylum seekers and refugees come from. This asylum seeker is a political term. It doesn't exist in the UN Convention on Refugees. It doesn't say asylum seekers; it says refugee. So, but it's a political terminology used by politicians, to punish asylum seekers. If you look around the world, the conflict, in different countries, Britain is a major force in creating asylum seekers and refugees, creating, hate and hatred amongst different societies, different communities. Britain is the major force, replacing regimes or changing regimes. Britain is the major force contributing and weapons, selling weapons to rogue regimes, dictators, and mass murderers. The example is in Yemen, as you know, that many Yemenis are butchered, killed by British weapons sold to Saudi Arabia. These are the sort of things, but when the very victims, who run away from British and American NATO bombings, when they arrive here in Britain, you're told you're illegal, you're bringing disease, you're not wanted here, you're in prison. I know asylum seekers in this country, who are punished by the system here. I know a family, a husband is 72 years old, the wife is about 75 years old. They're here for the past 12 years, having every mental health issues in this country, not this family alone, but hundreds of families in this country, punished by the system. The system is, when we say the system is not fit for purpose, it is intentionally designed. It's very fit for purpose, according to the British state or the Tories, or if the Labour is in power. The asylum system is really fit for purpose in this country, if you know what I mean. It is designed in such a way to humiliate asylum seekers, to degrade asylum seeker, to insult asylum seekers, that you don't come here and you don't seek sanctuary in this country. And as we spoke earlier in the other session, that many of the great speakers who said, migrants contribute to the society. Look at just a week ago, an Afghan doctor, a GP in England, he was awarded one of the best doctors, Dr. Wahid Aryan, he was awarded to be the NHS best doctor in England. So I have plenty of colleagues from every country in this country, in Britain and Scotland included, that they are contributed to every way and every section or every part of the society. But sadly, we have a racist regime towards asylum seekers, towards Muslims, towards, migrants in this country. Right now, Afghans are told that we can still refuse you. If you look at the new country guidance policy just issued about 10 days ago by Priti Patel, released by the Home Office, that the British state will still refuse asylum seekers from Afghanistan, but they will not deport them. If you're not going to deport them, why are you going to refuse them? Because they become destitute, they become homeless, they become hungry. I know hundreds of asylum seekers in Glasgow who are destitute, not only from Afghanistan, from around the world, because they don't fit in this racist institution driven by the Tories and by Priti Patel and Boris and others, a club of the billionaire and millionaire. And when the same people come to this country, they're punished, and they're told that you're not wanted here. We don't want you because you're a waste on our resources. You're bringing diseases, as I said, and I always repeat myself, please pardon me for one last sentence. If we want less asylum seekers in this country, Britain should stop bombing other countries. They should stop supporting dictators and rogue regimes and brutal dictators. So, when you bomb a country, you displace the entire population. So please stop bombing other countries. Please stop launching illegal wars so people don't come here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mohammed, for that really powerful contribution about the plight of asylum seekers and refugees and Britain's role in whipping up racism against them. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Shavana Taj, TUC Wales General Secretary. Shavana is Wales TUC's first BME General Secretary, who joined Wales TUC from the Public and Commercial Services Union, that's the PCS, where she had been the Welsh Secretary. Shavana, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you to the previous speaker for really kind of setting the tone for the rest of the conference and some of the many important matters that we're going to be discussing today. But firstly, I think it's important that let me begin simply by saying shame on each and every one of those people who are currently cheering on a government who's willing and prepared to leave people to drown to protect their borders. I hope that those individuals can sleep at night and feel that they are on the right side of history. And indeed, I hope that they themselves are never in a situation where they are left with no other option but to risk their own lives and the lives of their loved ones to seek safety. And the other thing that I wanted to talk about, or just touch upon is, yet again, the word Islamist is trending on Twitter. So the news headlines are again talking, we're hearing the words Somalian origin, we're hearing the words Muslim migrant, we're hearing the words African appearance, alongside the words extremist, terrorist links, and of course, control the borders. And all of these words are then, of course, running alongside the murder suspect of David Ames MP. And, it was a completely, absolutely awful, despicable, awful act that took place. But the fact of the matter is that this person was a British national. Yet the word British national doesn't seem to be trending. But yet again, the word Muslim in Islam is the one that we keep seeing popping up time and time again. Now, lots of us have long argued that the word Islamist should never have become the reference point, or even anywhere near the acceptable terminology where you describe extremist, oppressive fundamentalism. And all of this has now become, so easy and interchangeable, because you use the word Islamist and then it becomes Islamic and then it becomes Muslim. And ultimately, when it comes down to the same acts that we see awful acts by individuals who are of white origin and may have the faith of Christians, their faith is never brought into play at all. But yet again, we are going to see this now happen because of the awful situation that we're seeing open up on our screens. And it is going to be ordinary people at street level who are going to be fearing for their lives. They are going to be scared. They are going to be wondering what people are thinking of them as they're standing for the bus, as they're waiting for the tube, as they're in their workplace. Everyone is going to be looking at them because all of a sudden you fit that description, because all of these negative connotations are then you fit the match. So one way or the other, it's back to you as an individual. But I also wanted to just kind of touch a little bit about what's happening here in Wales. So in Wales, there's this real strong tendency, and particularly within civil society and political circles as well, to be kind of complacent. We can be quite, self-congratulatory in our ideas about, who we are as a nation, and that we've got these shared values, and, they're really important to us, and we hold those very dear. But there was a piece of research that Hope Not Hate recently did. And it was quite interesting because it talked about Welsh social attitudes in relation to the impact on community cohesion post-Brexit, and how people were actually seeing people of colour. And there was this real clear link back to the economic prospects as we seek to recover from the COVID crisis as well. And the concerns really were expressed around the threat of redundancy, the lack of prospect for future generations, and then the persistently high rates of poverty, which have echoed again from our own research as well. And the uncomfortable reality is that the economic model in Wales, and as it is in other parts of the UK, has been completely broken and has been at crisis points for a very, very long time. So over the last decade, we've seen a massive sharp increase in insecure work, as well as major growth in in-work poverty. Households with at least one adult in paid work now makes up over half of all of those in poverty, undermining this idea of work as a guaranteed route to some form of economic security. So, it doesn't actually, it doesn't come as a surprise, therefore, to me to see that poverty as identified here again in this research as a major concern by 2/3 of the population. And the frustrations that have been created by that failing economy, we know can create fertile conditions for the growth of support for divisive campaigns of the populist right. And there's real now, warning signs. For example, despite the fact that when it comes to Black minority ethnic unemployment has risen 3 times as fast as white unemployment during the COVID crisis, almost half of the adult populations in Wales actually believes that discrimination against white people is as big of a problem as discrimination against non-white people. So it's really hard to maintain that we have a very healthy civic culture when there is this real detachment from the objective reality. And, as the General Secretary of the Wales TUC, I've become extremely conscious of the real role that the trade union has got to continue and be very much at the forefront of working with organizations like Stand Up to Racism and other groups to tackle these challenges. And not least because as we begin to, there's all this discussion continuously. We hear from Boris about leveling up, and we hear about, fair work and equality and inclusion and so forth. But ultimately, if we are going to have a secure economic recovery that is going to be empowering workers, that we then have that rebalancing of power between the bosses and the workers as well. And ultimately, this is, if we do not address the economic frustrations that people are actually feeling, we are not actually going to be able to rebuild any form of trust across our communities that resemble, any level of this idealized image that we would love to see. But if we do not actually have some of those hard conversations continuously, and not just address them during the period of Black History Month, for example, or we address them because, of course, we're seeing Black Lives Matter, we're seeing protests at street level, and organizations put out some really strong statements and so forth, we're not actually going to see any change. So we have to fundamentally challenge those real issues that affect everyday people on a day-to-day basis if we are going to move forward, because what's in front of us is not looking good at all, particularly given the current situation and what we're seeing.
Thank you very much, Shavana, for your contribution. And thank you for joining us and highlighting the role that trade unions have to play, and having the powerful points that you did to share with us today. Actually, there's been a lot of sort of positive comments as well in response to your contribution. Dennis has commented, I agree with Shavana, shame on those cheering on this government that allows refugees to drown. In response to our earlier speaker, Mohammed Asif, we have somebody saying, well said, brother, somebody who's coming from Deepak, North Staffordshire. So thank you, Shavana, and thank you, Mohammed, for both of your contributions. To bring in our next speaker swiftly, I'd like to bring in Ulrike Schmidt. Ulrike is a regional team coordinator for Amnesty International, and is a former teacher based in Woburn Forest, and was part of the successful mobilizations against fascists in East London. So a warm welcome to Ulrike.
Thank you, Nadia. Yeah. Well, the recent shocking scenes at Kabul airport have shown the world the despair that forces people to flee their countries, to flee war and brutal and repressive regimes. Now, the vast majority of the world's refugees are hosted in very poor countries. I mean, just a little comparison, there are 4.5 million Syrian refugees in Turkey. That is many more than in the whole of Europe together. Few take the dangerous journey to reach Europe, lured by promises of democracy, rule of law, respect for human rights, and they are let down very badly. At the external borders in Greece, Croatia, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Poland, refugees experience brutality and violence at the hands of border police, who are briefed to keep refugees out. Thousands are dying to attempt to cross the Mediterranean Sea in small unseaworthy boats. And worst, search and rescue has now largely been outsourced to the Libyan Coast Guard, with the aim of keeping refugees out of Europe. Now, between January 2021 and June, 15,000 refugees were intercepted by the Libyan Coast Guard, which is financed and trained by Italy and helped by Frontex surveillance planes to find the boats. Of these 15,000, only 6,000 could be accounted for in June, 6 months later. And we know that in the DCIM centers in Libya, refugees get tortured, raped, subject to extortion, and many are killed. Now, NGOs involved in search and rescue in the Mediterranean are criminalized. At the moment, there are 21 search and rescue crew from Médecins Sans Frontières, from Jugendrettet, and from Save the Children in the dock in Italy. And in the UK, of course, the UK government is attempting to dismantle the right to asylum with the new Nationality and Borders Bill. And Priti Patel talks of pushing refugees back over the British Channel. We believe that the violations documented against refugees and migrants are not an accident, but the clear and anticipated outcome of Europe-wide supported systems just designed to keep refugees out at all costs. So because of that, and in order to highlight this and to campaign against all of these abuses, including the Nationality and Borders Bill in the UK, we have organized a demonstration for the 23rd of October. We are starting off at 12 noon at the Italian embassy to campaign against the collaboration of Italy with the Libyan Coast Guard, and also the criminalization of search and rescue teams. And from there, we are going to walk to Malta, to the Maltese embassy, where we are campaigning for all charges against 3 young men who are in the dock in Malta for saving over 100 lives, all those charges to be dropped. And then we are heading off to the Home Office to campaign about the UK policies. Our headline speaker is Jeremy Corbyn, and I hope I will see many of you there. I hope to see you outside Parliament on Wednesday the 20th, protesting against the Nationality and Borders Bill, and on the 23rd, campaigning for refugees across Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rick, for that great contribution and for plugging that demo. We're going to post links and more information to the demo you were talking about in the chat, so please look out for that. I just want to read some solidarity comments. So we've got solidarity from Canada. We've got solidarity from Toronto in Canada. We've got solidarity from people watching in Cambridge, Nottingham, Woking, Tottenham in North London, Portsmouth, Stoke. So, you know, we're international, as we would say. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. I am going to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Marwan Mohammed, who is the former director of Collective Against Islamophobia in France, the CCIF, the most prominent human rights NGO supporting Muslims in France. Marwan?
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, and congratulations to every speaker before me for their contribution. It was really touching, heartwarming, and also worrying to see the extent of human rights abuses and discrimination in your respective contexts. I'll try to share a few remarks and information with you on the current situation in France. As you've been following in the last few years, there has been weaponization of a number of common values that we have in France, such as freedom of expression or laïcité. And these values, they have a very positive connotation in the French context, but they have been turned away from their initial definition to use them as means of exclusion and specifically targeting Muslim communities. So what we've witnessed is not only what you observe in the UK and elsewhere in terms of securitization of Muslim communities, but also the construction of a Muslim problem in other parts of the social life and the political life in France. And the government of Emmanuel Macron, which was supposed to be elected against the far right, eventually turned up to be the government to lead the worst public policy against French Muslim communities. They crack down on Muslim families and innocent Muslim families. They've tried to target Muslim NGOs and any organization addressing or criticizing Islamophobia in France. And now they are looking at mosques and local associations to close them down. So we are following now a problematic routine where instead of taking organizations to court if they did anything wrong in terms of hate speech or in terms of financial irregularities or anything else, or incitement to terrorism or the likes, because they know that they have absolutely no legal ground to do so, they take what we call administrative measures, which do not need to show the burden of proof in terms of illegal activities. So they close down mosques or they close down organizations, and even when you take them to court, there has been a very interesting legal decision. For instance, you remember that the Collective Against Islamophobia in France last year was dissolved. So, of course, they created a European organization to protect the continuity of their activities and continue to support victims of discrimination and hate crime. But they took the issue to court for legal validation. And when it reached the highest court in France, which is the Conseil d'État, basically the verdict is like really interesting. They said that contrary to what the government has said, the Collective Against Islamophobia had absolutely nothing to do with terrorism or condoning terrorism or political violence. Also, there is no responsibility, no legal violation of any kind in the CCIF's activity, whether it be verbal discussions or declarations or conferences or physical activities in terms of funding or field actions in terms of grassroots works with communities. But the sole fact that the Collective Against Islamophobia in France claims that there is structural Islamophobia in France and that the government has a political responsibility for the continuity of this Islamophobia, this in and of itself constitutes, in the eye of the highest court, an incitement to hatred against France, because it gives a bad image of France nationally and internationally. And this is really shocking because this creates a precedent, and the Human Rights League in France has complained, Human Rights Watch International has complained, Amnesty International has also expressed a lot of concern, but we're past a point now in France where the government simply could not care less. They think that they paid the price in terms of reputation internationally, and that they already paid the price for this, so they don't have to show signs of goodwill, and they have anything to prove in their perception. So now they have like their free hands to harm and target any dissenting organization, whether they be Muslim or not. So you see that it is more than ever time for international support and to express concerns, and also to identify ways through which you can express support for communities in France. Otherwise, Muslim communities and local communities are simply left alone, and now they cannot rely anymore on the legal areas or on the courts to support their rights and defend their rights. I'd like to thank you once again for your attention, and I wish you a lot of courage and solidarity in all your endeavors. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marwan, and solidarity to activists like yourself and others who are fighting Islamophobia in France. And really that gives me the opportunity to raise next month, Islamophobia Awareness Month, something where Stand Up to Racism is going to be having events and initiatives throughout November to mark Islamophobia Awareness Month. And links are being put in the chat. So if people want to find out more as to the initiatives that will be happening, just go on social media and type I am 20, or you can also go on MEN's Muslim Engagement and Development's website to find out more about local activities and so on that are happening near you. So thank you very much, Marwan. And just to read out as well some messages of solidarity, we have more people sending solidarity from Denmark, Gloucestershire, Washington, DC, South London, Swansea, Derby, Birmingham, and Chesterfield. So thank you for people sending in their messages of solidarity, and do keep them going. I'm going to introduce now our next speaker, who is Elise Bryan, who Elise is the president of the Coalition of Labour Union Women America. She's been involved in Unite Against Hate, which is a coalition of groups and individuals building a permanent movement of broad active resistance against violence, or violent racist and far-right groups, and the threat of fascism in the United States. So a massive welcome from across the pond, Elise, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Nadia. Greetings, sisters, brothers, siblings, comrades, family. Now let me start by giving honor to the First Nations, indigenous people on this continent on whose stolen land I stand. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. I salute the speakers who have gone before me, who have shared knowledge. And I'm taking the words asylum seeker out of my vocabulary, putting in refugee. I'm going to refer to the people who stormed the Capitol of the United States no longer as domestic terrorists, but as Christian terrorists. And I'm going to celebrate Islam and the people of faith in this coming month. So it is an honor to join you, my siblings from around the world, to plan our work and to work our plan to stop the apocalyptic rise of racism. I say apocalyptic, not to feed the fear instilled by the rise of dystopia films, and if it bleeds, it leads mainstream media. I'm talking about the original Greek meaning of the verb apocalypse, to uncover, reveal, lay bare, or disclose. We're not talking about the end of the world. We're talking about the capitalist corporate ruling class using the political construct of race to divide the working class. I have to give credit to my Detroit sister, Adrienne Marie Brown, for this idea. She said last year, things are not getting worse. They're getting uncovered. We must hold each other tonight and continue to pull back the veil. My world family, I join with you to continue to pull back the veil of racist attacks by wannabe totalitarians like Prime Minister Boris Johnson and his former running buddy, Donald the Big Lie Trump, and too many more to name in my 5 minutes. So how do we defeat racist offensive of the ruling class and its political puppets? One, remember what you said so well in the meeting, the pulling together this meeting. There are more of us than there are of them. Anti-racists are the majority, but not all of us are aware of that power. That's why grassroots education is so important. We've got to take the truth to the people, or they'll keep buying into the despair and hopelessness peddled by the corporate elite-driven media. Speak truth to power. Tell the stories that you all shared here today about what's happening in your countries and in our neighborhoods, and take it to the streets. You better believe that the marches that were reported around the world after the murder of George Floyd scared the bejesus out of the elite. Look what they're trying to do in the United States to stop people from voting. 18 states have already enacted 30 laws this year that will make it harder for Americans to vote. So we got to keep using the power of Zoom. Oh my God, it's amazing. Here I am, 13 minutes from the capital of the United States of America on Zoom with you all on this platform, whatever forces we need around the world to work to end the attacks on immigrant workers who are fleeing their countries, as was said before me, because of the wars created there by the group of 8 world leader gang of thieves who looted Africa and the Middle East and the East and so-called New World to build their wealth. We've got to get our people out to vote, not only vote, but to run for office. I've heard people here today who will make a better prime minister than the current one. And to paraphrase the words of the US Constitution, we, the working class of the world, in order to form a more perfect union of peace and justice for all, shall march. We shall vote. We shall stand up to racism wherever it rears its murderous head. This is Elise Bryan. And in the name of my ancestors, in the name of the members of the Coalition of Labor Union Women, in the name of the children who held in cages in the United States, in the name of all refugees and all seeking citizenship, in the name of the ancestors who dreamed of this day of us coming together, I sing, we shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. Thank you, family.
Thank you very much, Elise. Always a pleasure to have you on and to have your perspective about how people are fighting and challenging racism in the United States. Thank you again for joining us. I'm going to do some solidarity messages. So we've got solidarity from Wales, Burton-on-Trent, Swansea, West London, Loughborough. These are all places in the UK, Derbyshire. We do also have some solidarity all the way from Bulgaria, from Steve. So we are truly international in our reach. I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Zoe Reed. Zoe is the chair of Society for Anglo-Chinese Understanding, SACU. She's been the chair since 2009. She has direct interest in building links and understanding with China. She's also the director in an NHS Foundation Trust, which provides mental health services, and wrote a book, Illuminating the History of British-Chinese Relations. Zoe, pleasure to have you join us.
Thank you so much, and it's lovely to join you. And I've already learned so much, and so it's been fabulous so far. So yep, the Society for Anglo-Chinese Understanding, we've been promoting friendship and understanding between the peoples of Britain and China for over 56 years. So clearly, the rise in xenophobia is something of great concern to us. So I just wanted to update you with what we've been working on, and to thank my colleague Iris Yao, who helped me with some of the research for my little talk. I'm going to try and keep to my deadline, so I'm going to try and rush through. So what we did, first of all, was we organised an online panel, Standing Up to Xenophobia, to try and look at the particular nature of racism against people of Chinese heritage. Had great speakers, including your own Sabi Dalu, who thank you for inviting me here today, Sabi. So, I mean, one of the fundamental things I think we need to think about is, why is casual racism okay against, people of Chinese heritage? It just like drips into the language and it seems to be okay. So, before I start onto that, really just to say that as for other groups, racism has got markedly worse since the pandemic, with a devastating impact on Chinese and East Asian heritage people and their businesses in the country. On our panel, we had Yao Poon, who's a leading member of CARG, which is the COVID-19 anti-racism group, and SACU was an early supporter of them. I mean, I don't need to tell you, I'm sure you're keeping up with the attacks, but they're kind of all across the country and wide demography. So starting right after the pandemic started in February last year, a student was beaten up in London. In the April, a pensioner was attacked in London. February this year, a lecturer was attacked in Southampton. May, a student was attacked in Sheffield. And just last month, an engineer was attacked and beaten up in Cambridge. So it's all over the country and it's pretty horrific. And in terms of stats, those that like numbers, there's been a 300% increase in racist and violent hashtags against Chinese and Chinese people. And research done by another organization called End Violence and Racism Against East and Southeast Asian Communities looked at data. They did a FOI and they got 65% of the police forces to send them stuff. And they identified nearly 6,000 recorded cases of violence and racism between 2018 and 2021. So that was a 27% increase in hate crime. The ITV News item on this research said that the cases were demonstrably racially motivated because as the people were being beaten up and physically attacked, they were subject to racial slurs and being told to go back where you come from. I mean, that kind of resonated with my personal experience, which was pre the pandemic, when I was standing on London railway platform on my own one night, and somebody shouted at me to F off back to Hong Kong. I mean, mine was only a verbal attack, but it's pretty scary nevertheless. So I dread to think what's happening for everyone across the country. So at our Standing Up to Xenophobia panel, we tried to discuss what's distinctively different about racism against people of Chinese heritage in this country, and how it's kind of got into our psyche that somehow the Chinese are so different that negative assumptions about them are okay. I mean, example from my own experience was when I was at a large medical conference in 2014, when UK healthcare professionals were reporting on their work in West Africa during the Ebola outbreak. Their report included that they were working alongside Chinese healthcare staff, and that a massive amount of Chinese planes and equipment had also been brought in and was helping right from the start. And a ripple of laughter went across the conference. To this day, I regret not speaking up and questioning, so why did this information elicit laughter rather than applause at that contribution from China? So our panel examined the way popular culture has inculcated our thinking, and Dr. Jenny Clegg, who's a SACU vice president, spoke about her book, Fu Manchu and the Yellow Peril, The Making of a Racist Myth. And Jenny's book tracks these stereotypes back to the character of Fu Manchu, who was very popular in the 1920s in films and books in this country. And he was portrayed very much as this Machiavellian, stereotypical Oriental master villain. And these harmful stereotypes continue to this day, with David Williams thinking it's okay to include a short story in a kid's book about a Chinese boy, which podcaster Ma said was normalizing casual racism from an early age. I mean, whatever you think of David Williams, he did actually agree to remove the story from future editions. But I do think even he might have thought twice before including other ethnic stereotypes in his book. The campaigning group Friends of Socialist China have launched a statement calling on Western governments and media to cease their relentless propaganda war against China and to adopt a responsible and balanced approach. It points out that this propaganda war is an obstacle to the urgently needed cooperation between the world's major powers on key questions such as climate change and future pandemics. And obviously, part has been alluded to already by your colleague from the States. Part of this propaganda war includes Trump and his clung flu, can't even say it, and China virus statements. And would he actually have said such things about a virus first identified in another continent? So returning briefly to UK history and the treatment of Chinese people, the World War I Chinese Labour Corps was where 140,000 Chinese workers were recruited by the British government, and this Allied war effort was airbrushed in British history. I can see my time is up, so I will simply say that SACU's mission is to build friendship and understanding between the peoples of China and Britain, not just because it's the right thing to do, but it also helps UK thrive in a world in which China is increasingly playing its appropriate role. So it's kind of dangerous and unfair and stupid to let the propaganda war build on our ingrained culture of anti-racism, resulting in a massive rise in hate crime and xenophobia. So we must indeed mobilize the anti-racist majority to unite the world against racism and fascism. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Zoe. And thank you for joining us for the plenary. I thought that was quite an insightful and informative contribution. And actually, having joined the workshop earlier on fighting xenophobia and anti-Chinese racism, I'm quite glad that you managed to share some of that in this main plenary. So a massive thanks to you. And actually, what you're raising, Zoe, I think it's a good opportunity to raise the UN Anti-Racism Day mobilizations that will be happening in March of the new year. The mobilizations will be happening on the 19th of March. And if you go on to Stand Up to Racism's website, you'll be able to find out more as to what's happening locally to you for UN Anti-Racism Day. So do check that out, and links will be posted in the chat. I'd like to share apologies from Cornelia Kerth, who unfortunately is joining another conference today, and so cannot join us. But Cornelia is a federal chairwoman of the Association of People Persecuted by the Nazi Regime, Association of Antifascists. This is an organization that was founded in 1947 by people surviving resistance fighters and those persecuted from all political directions as an association of those persecuted by the Nazi regime. But Cornelia has kindly sent us a statement to read out for this plenary in support of the conference today. So Cornelia says, "Dear comrades and friends, unfortunately I cannot participate in this year's Stand Up to Racism conference, which I deeply regret. But I will try to give an idea about the far right in Germany and the importance of anti-fascist activity. Actually, the party Alternative for Germany has constantly moved further right since its birth in 2013 and must now be characterized to be the organizing center of the far right, as well as its representation in parliament. The AFD deputies use parliamentary sessions for anti-democratic, racist, homophobic and sexist propaganda and hate speech. They invite far-right academics and activists as speakers in public events. They organize in the House of Parliament. They employ members of various far-right and fascist structures into their offices. Thus, hundreds of neo-Nazis and extremely reactionary young academics can start a professional career paid by public funds. And they invited militant activists as press into the House of Parliament, who directly started to bother and intimidate members of Parliament of any other party and their collaborators while outside. An aggressive mob of corona deniers have also intimidated members of Parliament outside of the building, attempting to gain access. Right now, we must fear that the party's Desiderus Erasmus Foundation will be funded 16 million euros for political education, which means 16 million euros for the far-right propaganda paid for by tax. The appearance of the IFD was the beginning of a constant process of opening spaces for far-right ideology being considered as normal in public debates. One effect is that too many politicians of other parties do not hesitate to compete for right-wing voters, with the IFD adopting their objectives and wording. And of course, hate speech pronounced in Parliament does in fact encourage right-wing terrorism, because the common ideological thread of Nazis in Parliament and the lonely wolves committed to terrorist action is the conspiracy myth of the Great Replacement. In the federal elections we had in Germany just 3 weeks ago, the IFD lost voters compared to what they gained in 2017, now 10.3%, but achieved the first place among parties in one county, Thuringen, 24%, and a second place in Saxony, 24.6%. In both counties, the party does not make any effort to hide its Nazi ideology, and at the federal conference in December, the open Nazi personnel might take over officially. We are part of Stand Up to Racism Germany, created in 2016 to inform and campaign against the IFD. We organize workshops to enable and empower everybody who wants to intervene when far-right propaganda appears at schools or universities, in families or at work, in private or public places, what have you. And we organize protests wherever the IFD appears in public. In cities like Berlin and Hamburg, where strong anti-fascist movements exist, the IFD is not even able to find a hall for congresses and other political events or election parties. And wherever they organize, public information stalls, protests and so on appear immediately. There is evidence that these activities correspond with poor success of the IFD, unlike in Eastern counties where they are painfully strong and where we are too weak to intervene in a correspondent way, and their intimidation and physical attacks prevent people from taking a stand. It is extremely important for us to build the movement in southeastern parts of Germany in order to stop the Nazis and to prevent other forms of preparing the ground for them by lack of distancing. For us, it is very helpful to be in an international network with all of you, because through exchanging information and experiences, we may improve our capacity of analysis and intervention. Thanks to Stand Up to Racism in the UK for organising this conference, and hope to see you all live soon. That's from Cornelia, Kerth, sending us a message of solidarity from Hamburg. I'd like to bring in our next speaker, who is going to be Colette Levy. Colette was a hidden child and survivor of the Vichy regime in France, and just a child when the Nazis occupied France in 1940. Colette Levy was sent into hiding by her parents, who were later killed in the Holocaust. And Colette has been a lifelong campaigner against fascism and racism. So a massive welcome to Colette, and thank you for joining us for this conference.
Sadly, Colette isn't ready to join us quite yet. Nadia, you were busy reading the speech, so did not see the current update. Our next speaker would be Petros. So if you could introduce Petros.
Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation to this very important Stand Up to Racism conference. I was a little bit late to join and give you the information. I'm a coordinator of KEERFA, Movement United Against Racism and Fascist Threat, and also in councillor in Athens municipality. I was a little bit late because I was in another press conference about what is happening in the borders of Greece with Turkey. Two journalists, an artist, they just criticize Greek police for very strange methods of searching women, interrogate them, stripping them practically, searching them with, force them to open their legs and watching them. And this was about the activity of these solidarity people who are watching what is happening on the border. There are some people who are watching the movement of boats from Turkey to Greece. And what is happening practically there, it's the full violation of the rights of refugees, because the Greek state, and especially Minister Mitarakis, is now engaging in a method of illegal pushbacks. He's a person that says very happily, with the support of Commission and European Union, that we close the border, we force the arrivals of refugees down 95%. And the reality is that in this year, we had 3,000 illegal pushbacks. And what we say, what is illegal pushback? Imagine a boat of people who came from Afghanistan or from Syria with pregnant women, with children, people who trying to escape death. They're entering in a boat, and this boat, when it comes to Lesbos, when it comes to the Greek islands, the Greek Coast Guard is there, and they're taking them and they're just putting them in a life raft, and they're just pushing them back without nothing. They're stealing them, they're stealing their money, they're stealing their mobiles and so on. This is the reality of the European Union policy on the border. They are closing the border, they are making illegal pushback, and the refugees who are entering the country, they are in concentration camps in thousands. This is really a shame for Europe, and it is a very dangerous policy, because this kind of policy is opening the way for fascist attacks, for fascism and for far right all around Europe. Their only argument is that we have to close the borders because we are under invasion by different populations, by Muslims, and Europe is about Christians and white population. The population of Europe is going down, and they are waving the flag that there is a danger that the population of Europe will be substituted by alien populations, by Muslims and so on. So this racism is going on. Islamophobia is absolutely terrible, and they are murdering. If you count the numbers of people who are drowned in the Aegean Sea because they are closing the border, they are using methods in Libya which are very openly going back to slavery. They're putting these people in cages, and they're putting them going back to Africa. So all this policy of racism is opening the way of fascism, and we have to be very openly supporting open borders, close the detention centers, cancel all the racism voted. And the danger is there. So you can see just behind my back a big demonstration. This is a demonstration just outside, convicted as criminal organization, and the whole of their leadership went in prison. This was a huge success of the anti-fascist movement. an anti-fascist movement who fought them the last 10 years when they got 500,000 votes, 20 MPs, and they were the third political party during a period of crisis, of severe attack on the population with austerity packages and so on. And we succeeded in isolating of the working class movement with general strikes, with the teachers, with the hospital workers, with other workers who supported the refugees and opposed the fascists. And that's very important. But we have to be very clear that it is not the end of the story. And just to celebrate, 1 year after that, we are facing fascist attacks in Greece again. And the government is opening the space for them. And also the police is covering them. Just the last 2 weeks, what happened in Greece is very important, that they try in Thessaloniki to use one school as a space for attacks. And so the left responded, the students responded, and this became a battlefield for 2 weeks. The same happened in Athens when they attacked an open event of KEERFA, of our anti-fascist organization, celebrating the 1 year for the conviction of Gordon Dunn. So it's very clear that we never end with fascism. This has to be a priority for the left, for the working class movement, for the anti-fascists all around the world. We got the alarm when the fascists and the far right invaded Capitol in the United States. So it's very important to oppose them, to fight and resist them, because the problem is the system itself. It's capitalism that breeds war, breeds misery, destroys the planets, and we have the millions of refugees. And we have to be there united and stand up against them in a united way. We will join the 19th of March in 2022. We have the power to smash the fascists and open the border for the refugees. And this is the most important fight that we face in front of us. Thank you very much.
Hi.
Thank you very much, Petros. Apologies for not doing a proper introduction, but it's always good to hear from you about KEERFA and how you organized to defeat the fascists and the success of, defeating Golden Dawn last year. So thank you very much for joining our meeting. So I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Sandos Zoke, who's a Roma civil rights campaigner. Sandor campaigns in the horrific conditions being experienced by the Roma communities in Hungary. So Sandor can tell us a bit more.
Greetings, hello everyone. The 3-minute rule is just perfect for me today, as today is the day to choose a presidential candidate of the opposition here in Hungary. So that is the very first time in our post-war history that a so-called pre-election is taking place. And as I'm officially one of the organizers, one of the observers to be present at the polling station, I have to be very, very short. Although I'm a Roma cause activist officially, tonight I would like to share with you just another aspect of the racism and xenophobia of the ruling government's politics. The handling of migrants is just one example. Let's call it the example of the day. It is the story of Abuzar Soltani, an Iranian refugee, and his 12-year-old son, Armin. They left Iran in 2016, and after waiting 2.5 years in Serbia, they at last received permission to enter Hungary. Thus, they arrived in the country legally. Nonetheless, they were put into a detention facility for the next 553 days until the notorious transit zone had to be closed. Their story is long and complicated, but it is worth spending the time to learn what's like to seek asylum in Hungary. The convoluted process lasted a total of 988 days and often seemed utterly absurd and hopeless. There were times when the Hungarian authorities refused to feed the father for weeks, and the child was deprived of years of schooling. Real waste, real cruelty. And yet this man was, of course, and is grateful, probably not anymore. In August, when he and his son at long last received asylum and protection from Hungary, Abuzar, greatly moved, said, "God bless Hungary. I love Hungary and the Hungarians. I have been waiting for this for 2 years and 8 months. Thank you so much for taking me in and giving me refugee status." And 1 month later, what happens? The Hungarian authorities sent him back to Iran, I learned today, without any explanation. They just decided so. I could talk, of course, hours long about more serious affairs, the oppression against NGOs, the perpetual discriminatory treatment of Romas, of course, and other minority groups, by the way. There are plenty of Tehran's examples, but I picked only, I say, the news of the day. Anyway, let's hope that this pre-election today will bring some hope. But I have to run, so thank you for having me, and I hope that I can bring some better news maybe next year.
Thank you very much for joining us, Sandor, and huge wishes of solidarity to you and Roma activists fighting in Hungary and fighting alongside you. So thank you very much for joining us for the international conference.
Thank you for having me.
And good luck with what you'll be joining next after this. All right. I am very excited to introduce now who's going to be speaking, Colette Levy, who is Colette Levy, who I'd introduced earlier, but just to recap, Colette was a child when the Nazis had occupied France in 1940 and is a survivor of the Vichy regime. And Colette has been a lifelong campaigner against fascism and racism ever since. So huge welcome to Colette. I'll hand over to you.
Hello. I just want to tell you that about my own experience as a child. I was a hidden child during the Second World War. My father was in a camp in Auschwitz, probably died there or somewhere in any camp around, any other camp. I'm not sure where exactly. But I want to tell the conference that they have to be very aware of the rise of fascism and anti-Semitism in Europe and in other countries. And perhaps you have to be aware of all the fascist groups in Britain, such as the BNP, EDL,
Football Lads Alliance,
the football
Lads Alliance, Football Lads Alliance.
Okay, the football racism, and so you have to be always very vigilant because things haven't improved all that much, and a lot of people have attacked even a woman who was in a camp and lived afterwards in Paris. An old lady, her neighbor stabbed her to death, and this was terrible. So you see, it's still very alive, and we have to be vigilant forever. So I hope that people will be strong enough to mobilize and to fight against any form of fascism in this country or any other country.
Say why you're a fighter. Huh? Say why you're a fighter. Say why you're a fighter.
I'll be fighting for this all my life, and I will always be very, very strong against fascism. I teach at U3A, and there's one woman who is supposed to be Jewish from Iraq and who lived in Israel and so on. She's an absolute racist. And there's also this ultranationalism in some countries, which really don't help at all. When I mentioned something about Daniel Barenboim, she said, oh, he's awful. And she comes to my class for French lessons, although she's quite good at French. And besides that, she's so anti-Arab, and yet she's teaching Arabic in that university. And I don't want her in my class, but she still comes. And I don't know what to do with her, but you know, you have these idiotic people who are absolutely confused in their identity. They think they have one identity. We have so many identities. We are not one thing. We are so many things. I mean, personally, I'm French, I'm European, and I'm a citizen of the world. And I want to remain that way. Yeah. Okay, so I think I have nothing more to say. And I hope that you will be mobilizing as ever against this terrible thing of racism and fascism.
Thank you very much, Colette. We appreciate that you made the time to join us and to share your story and your contribution. Thank you. I'm gonna introduce our next speaker, but before I do that, I just wanna say it's really great to have, you know, over 1,600 people registered for the conference. Obviously, we have tomorrow's workshops and the closing rally as well tomorrow. So it's really great to see people register and tune in and participate. And those of you watching on the live stream and in the Zoom links, we have over 500 people watching. It's excellent to have you all here. So I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Nahala Ashraf from Stand Up to Racism. Nahala is the co-chair of Greater Manchester Stand Up to Racism and was a leading figure in dashing Tommy Robinson's electoral chances in the Northwest. Nahala?
Hi, and thanks for having me. So it's worth saying it's 20 years since 9/11 attacks. And during this time, we've seen Western governments build up Muslims as the dangerous other, you know, the enemy within. And the so-called war on terror basically helped the US and its allies to justify imperialist wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and the wider region of the Middle East. And the attacks on really the rights of Muslims and immigrants here at home under this guise of combating terrorism. But I think it's really important to say that many of those terrorist groups didn't exist before the war on terror, and that the majority of the victims of the wars and also these new terrorist groups are people of the Middle East themselves and the wider region. And it's also really important to say that the wars in the Middle East have had a direct impact on Muslims and Islamophobia here. YouGov poll in 2017 pointed out that the majority of British people supported the idea of racial profiling against Arabs. In 2019, YouGov found that 38% of British people believe that Islam was not compatible with Western values. And it's not a surprise when you think about some of the rhetoric that we're getting from our politicians. Think about Boris Johnson, the comments that he made comparing women in the burqa to letterboxes and bank robbers. Islamophobic attacks jumped by 375% in the following week after those comments. And those are really shocking figures, but it's even more shocking to learn that an internal inquiry by the Conservatives basically found Johnson's comments to be what they called respectful and tolerant. And I think it's incidents like this that really help to normalize Islamophobia in wider society. In 2018 alone, in France, we saw a 52% increase in Islamophobic attacks. In Austria, there was a rise of around 74%. So across Europe, I would say you've got an Islamophobic street movements and political parties that are really become more popular. And their ideas have really begun to be incorporated. And I think in some ways even fed by the machinery of what we call the modern state, casting Muslims as a threat. And I think from the street to the state, Islamophobia has now become baked into European political life. Far-right parties built around Islamophobia and the politics of counter-jihad have become electorally successful across Europe. We've got the Sweden Democrats, the Alternative Party for Germany. We've got Spain's Vox Party, and in Austria, we've got the Freedom Party. And their ideas have shifted the rhetoric and policies of centre-right parties across Europe. So you've got the banning of the hijab in French schools and the restrictions for teachers in some parts of Germany, to an outright ban on face covering in public spaces in Denmark, Belgium, and France. This really goes to show just how anti-Muslim sentiment has moved from the fringes of society into the heart of government. And in Britain, you can see that with the use of the Schedule 7 of the Counter-Terrorism Act, which is basically legislation that allows people to be stopped at ports without any reasonable suspicion. And then there are policies that are in the, there in the name of countering violent extremism that basically focus on the supposed threat of radicalization and extremism. Across Europe, such policies expand policing and counter-terrorism to allow Muslims to be treated as legitimate objects of suspicion. And I think Britain's led in the way on this. So in 2011, it expanded the scope of its counter-terrorism policy, known as PREVENT, to include non-violence as well as violence manifestations. And it pushes public sector workers to spy on Muslims for signs of radicalization and non-violent extremism. Right now, I would say the worst example of mainstream politicians using Islamophobia to outflank the far right is in France. And I guess many of you, if not all of you, will remember the images of the 4 police officers standing over a Muslim woman. And they were, armed police officers and they stood over this woman while she's on a beach and basically forced her to undress. Clearly in France, we all talk about the right to support women's right to choose how she dresses, but if you're a Muslim woman, you don't have the same rights. And while rising Islamophobia is particularly bad in France, the factors behind that are, not just unique to France. Here in Britain, it wasn't so long ago that Tommy Robinson tried to capitalize on the despair people in the Northwest were feeling after years of Tory austerity agenda and rising Islamophobia to try and get elected to the European Parliament. Before that, we had obviously the BNP as well. But it's really important to say that, we were able to build a united campaign and to actually smash his campaign and the BNP before that. And those campaigns are, made up of black and white people together, but at the heart of those campaigns was the organized trade union movement. And I would say right now, Britain looks very different from many countries across Europe. And I think part of that is because of the work that we've done around building these united front movements and having Muslims and black people at the heart of those movements, leading those movements. And I just want to say it's really important that we continue the fight for the rights of refugees and immigrants, many of who are fleeing from predominantly Muslim countries. Petros before me has talked about the impact and the attacks on refugees and why they're happening and the connection between the attacks on refugees and the rise of the far right. And I think it's really important to say, though, that here in Britain, the Tories have done a massive amount of work to really blame, refugees, immigrants, people seeking asylum for the problems that the rest of us are facing in society. But it's really important also to say that they're not winning. If you look at the work that we've done with organisations like KEERFA, it's clear that working class people in Britain aren't buying into the Tory racist rhetoric towards refugees. So my final couple of things to say is we want everyone to support the National Day of Action on the 20th of October. We're asking people wherever they are in the workplace to get involved, set up a selfie, tweet your support for refugees, and obviously support the demonstration on the 23rd of October in the centre of London. There will also be demonstrations going on locally across the country, so please follow your local stand up to racism groups, get involved, and let's make sure we end racism.
Thank you very much, Naila. I think that was quite a powerful contribution. And just to reiterate, just to sort of build on the things Naila was saying, just a reminder that next month in November is Islamophobia Awareness Month. And Stand Up to Racism is going to be launching all different initiatives and actions throughout the month for Islamophobia Awareness Month. So if you want to find out about these, go to the website of MEND, Muslim Engagement and Development, and you'll be able to find out local activities there. But as Naila said as well, Islamophobia is obviously a double-edged sword with xenophobia and anti-migrant and anti-refugee racism and discrimination. So just to repeat the date that Naila had said, Stand Up to Racism was called a National Day of Action on the 20th of October to oppose the Racist Nationality and Borders Bill that's being passed through. So if people go on to Stand Up to Racism's website or contact Stand Up to Racism, they can find out more as to what's happening locally to them for the day of action. And we want to see as many workplaces and localities taking part in the day as possible. To introduce our final speaker for what's been a fantastic plenary and incredibly powerful with all the different international contributions we've heard from, I'm going to bring in Sabi Dalu, who is the co-convener of Stand Up to Racism and has been an anti-racist campaigner and activist for a few decades now. So a warm welcome to Sabi.
Thank you so much, Nadia, for that introduction, and a very big thank you to all of our speakers who have joined the panel today. I thought all the contributions were excellent, touching on all the very many different aspects of racism that we unfortunately have to address. And I also want to thank everyone the audience, everyone who's participating, watching live or joining the webinar live here today. Thank you so much for taking time out to join us. Firstly, I think it's important that on behalf of Stand Up to Racism, I pass on our condolences to the family of David Amess MP, who was brutally murdered yesterday in his constituency. So our thoughts go out to his family and friends. I also think it's important for us to acknowledge the victories that we've seen in the last year since our last conference in October 2020. So firstly, Donald Trump was defeated in the 2020 US presidential election. So he is no longer the president of the US. And whatever we think about Joe Biden's presidency and the what's happening in America at the moment, I think that we can all agree that the defeat of Donald Trump was a big defeat for fascists and racists across the globe. So we should remember and recognize and celebrate that. Secondly, earlier this year in April, Derek Chauvin was convicted for the murder of George Floyd. So we should remember and recognize that also, because securing the conviction of a police officer for the murder of a Black person, not just in the US, but in Britain and in European countries is very difficult. So that is a victory. And finally, I think some of the football teams that have been really leading the way in campaigning against racism and raising awareness has been tremendous. You know, the way they've been taking the knee, the amount of countries that did that during Euro 2020. It's important because it reaches such a mass audience. And I think it's important to recognize that all of these legacies are legacies. All of these victories are legacies of the Black Lives Matter movement. I don't believe Donald Trump would have been defeated. I don't think Derek Chauvin would have been convicted. And I don't think we would have seen the response that we've seen in the footballing world to anti-racism and taking the knee if it wasn't for the Black Lives Matter movement. So the legacy of the 2020 Black Lives Matter movement lives on. However, that said, we've also seen racists and fascists in the US attacking Congress. During those riots, we saw anti-Semitic t-shirts. We even saw Republican Congresswoman Mary Miller praising Hitler, saying Hitler was right when she was addressing one of these fascist rallies. So we've seen lots of problems as well that threaten democracy and freedom of speech, and that actually threaten the Black community. And so we see what happens when the Black community make its voice heard in the US, and we see the same in Britain. And also, in addition, we saw on that day when Capitol Hill was attacked, we also saw what people described as the passive ambivalence of the FBI. And unfortunately, that sort of passive ambivalence isn't something that's afforded to Black protesters. Also, if we're serious about Black Lives Matter, and if governments are serious about Black Lives Matter, And then that means addressing the issues that face the Black communities in a serious way. That means we must be decriminalizing the Black community. There must be root and branch change in the policing system. We see more Black people incarcerated today in the US than we saw enslaved in America 200 years ago. And similar things are being experienced by Black people in Britain. They face institutional racism in the criminal justice system and are more likely to be imprisoned than their white counterparts. And of course, Black people are still being killed by the police with no justice. We saw someone being killed by the police the same day that Derek Chauvin was convicted, and that still goes on today in Britain too. So, we need to see root and branch reform and a commitment to eradicate institutional racism in order to take Black Lives Matter seriously and address the problems of the police killing Black people and the lack of justice for this behaviour and the criminalisation of the Black community. But also for Black lives to really matter, there must be reparations for slavery. So we support Professor Hilary Beckles and the CARICOM reparations commissions, which, amongst other things, are calling for people like Richard Drax MP for South Dorset to hand over Drax Hall estate back to Barbados. So the Drax family, essentially, it's an old slave plantation in Barbados, which is still owned by the Drax family, and it still grows sugar. So, in order to take Black Lives Matter seriously, there has to be some economic reparations for the Black community. In a session earlier during the conference, Lawrence Davis, the solicitor, the Equal Justice Solicitor, is also the solicitor for Belly Majenga, who was killed by someone who assaulted her and spat at her while she was working at Victoria Station in London. He said that in order to achieve economic equality for the Black community in Britain, the British government must hand over £300 billion to the Black community. And he said that anything else is just cosmetic if you're really serious about addressing inequality and eradicating institutional racism for the Black community. So some food for thought there for everybody. And then secondly, regarding Islamophobia, obviously Naila, just before me, spoke very eloquently about Islamophobia. Marwan Mohammed made an excellent contribution, as did Shavana Taj. And I just want to say, in light of the attack on David Amess MP yesterday, I concur that, we are seeing, irresponsible terminology by the press like Islamism, Islamist terrorism and so on being used. That sort of language fuels Islamophobia. But I think this one quote by French sociologist Oliver Roy probably sums up the counterproductive nature of this type of approach to eradicating terrorism, because that type of Islamophobia has done nothing to eradicate ISIS-type terrorism. So just to quote from a piece by Oliver Roy in the Financial Times on the 7th of November 2020, who essentially said that Muslims were not radicalized in mainstream mosques. So he said, rather, most were radicalized among small groups of friends and relatives, often in a milieu characterized by petty crime and delinquency. They used the internet to find texts and inspiration and made little or no reference to the tenets of Sharia law. They came from the margins of Muslim life in France, not the center. Could the measures now being proposed have prevented any of the terrorist attacks carried out in France since the bombing of the Paris metro in 1995? The answer seems to me is no. And I think we can say the same thing about measures such as Prevent in Britain. And then finally, I just want to echo the point made by Zoe Reed earlier. Regarding xenophobia and attacks on Chinese, East and Southeast Asian communities. So in the US earlier this year, we saw a terrorist attack in Atlanta, Georgia, in the US, which killed 8 people, most of whom were of Chinese or East or Southeast Asian origin. And in Britain, we've seen racist attacks increase by 50% in 2 years on these communities. So I do think it's important to stop blaming China for COVID, because it's that type of rhetoric that has led to these attacks, and obviously COVID hasn't gone away. So I think the points that the speakers today have mentioned and the points that I've raised today in my speech really illustrate the importance of the World Against Racism Network and the importance of UN Anti-Racism Day and marking that day as an international day of action. And we'll be continuing to do that next year. So please join us on the 19th of March, 2022. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabi, for your contribution and for ending a round of speakers for today's plenary session. Again, just want to say a huge thank you to everyone for joining us online, for watching on Facebook and YouTube and in the plenary. Thank you to our speakers for their contribution and for their work that they do. A lot of people have been inspired. We've got solidarity from Chinese community in Birmingham. And in fact, as a Northfield takeaway, we will put in a flyer for the COP26 rally in Ichmil. So there you go. Lots of people doing things to highlight the links between climate change and racism. So thank you all very much. If you haven't already, I would definitely encourage you to join Stand Up to Racism. We've got lots of local groups up across the country. And as Sabi said, we've got a worldwide network as well. So please, if you're interested in connecting and linking with us so that you can set up organizations and campaign against racism and fascism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-Gypsy sentiments as well, please do let us know and we will connect with you. Again, thank you, everyone. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow. We've got workshops in the afternoon from 2 p.m. and we've got a fantastic lineup, a closing rally at 5 p.m. again. We've got Diane Abbott, MP, Gary Young, and a whole host of leading anti-racist activists who will be closing our conference tomorrow evening at 5 p.m. So I do hope to, I was going to say see you all there, but I do hope you will all join us again. Thank you very much.